My name is Dennis Samut. I'm the director of Links Europe, a peace-building organization based in The Hague in the Netherlands. For the last 30 years, I have traveled across the post-Soviet space and was close to many of the events and developments that impacted this vast region. In this series of video diaries, I will revisit some of the key issues that have dominated the region, and I will share some of my personal recollections and experiences. As recent developments in Ukraine have shown, much of what has happened in the past 30 years still has consequences in the present reality for people living in Europe and beyond. Whilst events in Georgia were moving at very rapid speed in the early 1990s and generally also in a very negative direction, developments were also taking place in the two neighboring republics of Armenia and Azerbaijan. There were similarities between the three countries, particularly when it came to the issue of economic collapse. All the three countries were connected with the Soviet command economy. And so once this command economy collapsed, it was difficult, especially in the early stages, to replace that with something different. In the South Caucasus, because in the three countries there is sort of extensive agriculture, I wouldn't say that anybody starved in the 1990s, but there were problems with the supply chain in pretty much everything that you could possibly imagine. There were huge problems with electricity, Georgia particularly, but also in Armenia at times. There were very long periods of electricity cuts that left the population, especially in the cities, well, throughout the country really, without electricity, without heating, and also without water, because the water supply also depended on electricity. I lived for some time in Georgia at the time, and it was not easy, I can say, to come back to this situation that people had got used to having gas, water, and electricity, and their absence, I think, is well remembered by all the people in the region of an age that they can still remember these events. But there was one issue that has dominated the South Caucasus since the early 1990s and this is the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan on Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh was a territory inside Azerbaijan with mainly Armenian-speaking population during the Soviet times. So it had a certain autonomy within the Soviet system. It was not a constituent republic, it was an autonomous oblast. And the relationship was always a bit uneasy between the majority Armenian population and the Azerbaijani authorities that had overall control. And when the Soviet Union started disintegrating, because what happened in December 1991 was actually the end of a process, there was an attempt to detach Nagorno-Karabakh from Azerbaijan and unite it instead with Armenia. And this led to a war, and this war played out in a very violent way over several years until 1994. In 1994, there was essentially a ceasefire, and the ceasefire saw a situation where Armenian forces had not only taken control over Nagorno-Karabakh, but had taken control over big chunks of territory around Nagorno-Karabakh that were part of initially of the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic and eventually of the Independent Republic of Azerbaijan. There has been pretty much a state of conflict between the two sides ever since. Since 1994, there was a ceasefire, an imperfect ceasefire, one has to say, broken several times, and then again in 2020 there was a fully fledged war that essentially saw Azerbaijan reversing the trend and reversing the situation. So they managed to take back most of the territories that they had lost in the 1990s. This conflict has had a tremendous impact on the South Caucasus. It not only affected issue of relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, it affected the whole dynamic within the South Caucasus, because whilst it is logical that the South Caucasus should be treated and should be approached as a region, and there are a lot of benefits for all the three countries if there is a regional approach to many issues, this has pretty much been impossible. So regional cooperation in the South Caucasus has been non-existent for the last 30 years. There have been very, very small attempts at not necessarily regional cooperation, but at least some kind of regional dialogue. And we were involved very intensively as an organization with this process in different fields. For example, for nearly 10 years, facilitated a process of dialogue between the parliaments of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And some people, when they listen to this, they say, "So what? What's the big deal?" There are regional parliamentary platforms everywhere. But actually, to have a regional parliamentary platform between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia was quite an achievement, because there was hardly any other regional platform. The situation after 2020 has now changed radically. And what we have seen in the last 2 years is a process that tries to reconcile the positions of the two sides, with the possibility that before the end of the year, 2023, we can see some kind of peace agreement that would, for the first time, hopefully create the possibility of interaction between the three countries and would start the process of normalizing Armenia-Azerbaijan relations. I say start the process because those people who think that if there's a peace agreement, if once somebody signs the piece of paper, there's going to be peace, this is naive. It's not going to be like that at all. Once somebody signs the piece of paper and there would be a peace agreement, that would be the start of a process. The start of a process to try to normalize relations, build the personal contacts, as I said earlier, that are hugely essential in the region, much more important than pieces of paper and political frameworks. The personal interaction between people of different ethnicities is very necessary. And I think this process is ongoing, and hopefully it will have a successful end after a very painful 3 decades in which tens of thousands of people have been killed in this senseless war. But if one wants to look at Armenia and Azerbaijan, they essentially followed somewhat different trajectories since their independence from Moscow in 1991. In both countries, there is a very strong sense of identity and a very strong sense of nationalism. This has been reinforced by the Karabakh War, because government was in the interest of governments to reinforce this narrative. But it didn't really need the war. This was very deeply rooted even before. What has dominated the picture in Azerbaijan is the fact that Azerbaijan became, after 1991, a major oil exporting country. Azerbaijan was an important oil-producing country in the beginning of the 20th century. So it was actually one of the first places where oil was extracted. One of the reasons why it was one of the first places was that literally oil was, you put your finger in the oil in the ground and the oil will come out. You did not have to do very much. So not a lot of technology was required. And so in the early 20th century, Baku became the oil capital of the world, if you want. And this had a number of consequences. First of all, it reinforced sort of the difference between urban Azerbaijan and rural Azerbaijan. Most of Azerbaijan is rural and agricultural, but for the first time, you now had a working class. And this made it a very unique place in the Tsarist Empire, of which it was part at the time, and later of the Soviet Union. When the communists started agitating at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, they were looking for the working class. But in Tsarist Russia, there was hardly any working class. There were a lot of peasants. But communism believed in the dynamics of the working class, and one of the few places in Tsarist Russia which had a working class was Baku. So Baku, quite unexpectedly, became a center of communist activity, with cells of communist organizers working with the oil workers in Baku, and this had an impact on both the political context and also on the role that Azerbaijan eventually started playing in the Soviet space. Armenia did not have oil, and so its trajectory was different. When Azerbaijan achieved independence in 1991, the oil that was on the land had been extracted a long time ago by the Soviets. Everybody knew there was oil in the sea, offshore, but the Soviets did not have the technology to take it out. The people who had the technology to take it out were BP, because BP had very successfully started taking oil out from the North Sea, north of Scotland, and had developed both the technology and the skills of workers to be able to do that. So in what was called the deal of the century, the Azerbaijan government signed a deal with BP to take out the oil from the Caspian Sea within the Azerbaijani economic zone and to be able to take it out to the markets. Then there was the second question, which is how was this oil going to get to the international markets? So there were some pipelines, but these pipelines were all old Soviet pipelines that connected Azerbaijani oil industry to Russia. And the Azerbaijani leadership understood clearly that if they just simply use these pipelines, then it means that it was their oil, but they were going to be completely dependent on the Russians in terms of its export. And so it was decided to build the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline that connects the oil supply from the Caspian Sea and takes it to the Mediterranean for onward transmission to the international markets. This was a game changer. It was a game changer for Azerbaijan. It was a game changer for the region. It made Georgia much more important as a transit country for oil resources. And we can see that this relevance continues until today. Now it's not only oil, but also gas. And at this time when Europe is seeking new suppliers for gas as an alternative to Russian gas, we can see the importance of this market and of these transit routes for this supply. Armenia does not have energy resources. It has some nuclear energy capacity, some of which it exports also, but Armenians are generally very industrious people who are very good at trading. And so once Armenia became an independent country, we saw a lot of effort to try to increase Armenian exports and to turn Armenia into a dynamic economy. This has been only partly successful. One of the reasons is that once the Nagorno-Karabakh war took place, the borders between Turkey and Armenia and Azerbaijan and Armenia were closed. So essentially, Armenia could export its goods through a bottleneck, this bottleneck being through Georgia, and in a much less efficient way from the south through Iran. This has impacted the Armenian economy. Of course, there were attempts to try to go for the type of industries that would not require massive transportation requirements, but you could only do that to a certain extent. Armenia also benefited from the fact that it had a very well-established diaspora, and this diaspora was not only in Russia, which is where most diasporas of the post-Soviet countries are. But Armenian diaspora came in two waves, and the first wave came after the 1915 genocide, and as a result of this wave of Armenian diaspora movement, you had a lot of Armenian communities established in Europe and in the United States. These communities have wielded a very important influence on Armenia. They have been very helpful in many ways. Some say also that they have been a problem in many other ways, because the diaspora has its own historical imagery, has its own priorities that are not essentially always the priorities of the people who are living actually in Armenia itself. So there was always this dynamic of reconciling the priorities of the diaspora with the priorities of the local population. Armenia went through a political process that is rather interesting and also very specific. And I would say that we need more time to actually be able to understand better how this political process is playing out. So initially, after independence, you had the election of a president who was part of the nationalist movement that agitated for the Armenian statehood, that agitated for Nagorno-Karabakh to be detached from Azerbaijan. But this president, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, despite the fact that he came from this community, from this background, he was also somewhat pragmatic and wanted quickly to do a deal with Azerbaijan once the First Karabakh War had finished and Armenia had won. He understood that there was a window of opportunity for Armenia to actually do a deal and get the best deal possible whilst it had all the cards. However, there were many, especially in Nagorno-Karabakh, who disagreed with him. And so what you had was pretty much a coup, which essentially got rid of Levon Ter-Petrosyan, and the person who was for a short time before the leader of Nagorno-Karabakh, Robert Kocharyan, came and took over as president of Armenia. Some say this was the tail wagging the dog, and there is a little truth in this, but this situation persisted because even when Kocharyan had his two terms, the president after him, Serge Sarkisyan, was also from exactly the same background. And so you had for quite a long time in Armenia, the leadership being persons from Nagorno-Karabakh. This was, not everyone in Armenia was comfortable with this, especially in Yerevan, where people sort of felt that this was not correct. And there was a lot of political tension in the air throughout this period. Essentially, in 2018, Nicole Pashinyan, a little-known politician, started a popular movement to change the government. He accused the government of fraud in the elections, and then he started a popular movement to change the government. And at the beginning, no one, absolutely no one, in Armenia or outside Armenia, took this guy seriously. Because he was sort of a lone figure. When he started marching, he became famous for his marches on foot. He was accompanied by half a dozen people. And people thought, what is this? But by the time this march reached Yerevan, it turned into a massive popular movement that actually forced the government of Serge Sarkisyan to resign. Nicole Pashinyan remains an enigma in Armenia as much as outside Armenia. Where does his power come from? It is important to understand, however, that what had happened in Armenia after independence, possibly even before, was that there was a very big gap between the political and intellectual elite of the country and the rest of the country. So the political and intellectual elite was on a different wavelength and speaking and discussing and arguing at a completely different wavelength than the rest of the country that had to cope with some very basic issues of daily life. What Nicole Pashinyan did, he ignored completely the first tier, the political and intellectual elite, and put his message clearly and directly to the rest of the country that up to that point had felt completely disempowered. And this is what secured his victory in being able to overthrow the government. But it also meant that he has won several elections that have taken place since in processes that have been considered to be reasonably fair, including an election after the massive Armenian defeat in 2020 in Karabakh. So hardly anybody that I have spoken to anywhere thought that Nikol Pashinyan could survive the defeat in 2020 as a political personality. But he survived. He went to the polls, and the country voted for him, to the shock of a lot of the Armenian intelligentsia. I have many friends in this circle, and before the election, they were assuring me the Pashinyan is finished. After the election, they couldn't explain what happened. So this is one of the realities of Armenian politics that is very interesting and not quite explainable still properly. So I think the time will have to pass before we can see the picture a little bit clearer. Domestically in Azerbaijan, it's been a bit less eventful because the government has been much more tightly controlled by the Aliyev family. So first it was Heydar Aliyev, who in a vein similar to Shevardnadze came back after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was also first secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan before in the 1980s, and then he came back at a time when the country was facing complete collapse. So Baku before the oil in the 1990s was a very terrible place. When I visited for the first time, I was really struck by, first of all, the sense of pain that was in everyone's heart after the defeat of 1994, the sense of collapse of the economy and of pretty much all the institutions, the fact that hundreds of thousands of IDPs descended on Baku and other major cities created conditions in the streets that were very, very dire. So Heydar Aliyev, on the one hand, in a vein similar to Shevardnadze, was able to stabilize the situation and to start the process of reversing it. His style was using more strong tactics than perhaps Shevardnadze did. I don't think Shevardnadze ever really used strong tactics within the Georgian political project, but Heydar Aliyev was a much tougher person, and he was succeeded by his son, who remains president until this day. And the rule of the Aliyevs pretty much has dominated Azerbaijani political life since around 1994 or thereabouts. So we have these 3 decades of Aliyev rule that have left an imprint on Azerbaijan. Of course, the difference in Azerbaijan is that the oil has produced enough money for the government to have a cushion in order to be able to deal with issues as they arise. So whilst there are sometimes expressions of public discontent, on the whole, there have not been massive outbursts of public discontent because the government is able to manage the situation because it has the resources to do so. But many ask the question, where will Azerbaijan go now? So on the one hand, the fact that they have been able to regain most of the territories that they lost in 1994 has given the country the opportunity to start thinking about other things for the future. For so many years, when you spoke to anyone in Baku, they would say, well, yes, we have problem A, we have problem B, but the most important problem for us is Karabakh and the issue of the territories. Well, that's resolved now to a point. So everybody's waiting to see what will happen next. For the last 30 years, I have spent a lot of effort with my team at Links Europe and at Links before that in the UK to try to promote dialogue between Armenia and Azerbaijan as part of this process for peace and reconciliation in the South Caucasus region. For most of the time, this work has been quite thankless. We were working with very little results to show. And I was always telling my colleagues, we need to have patience because this is not going to work as fast as we would like it to work, but the dynamic is the dynamic that exists in the region itself. We are now in a different point. For the first time in these 30 years, we can see that there is actually a hope for peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which would have a tremendous impact on the whole South Caucasus region. So our job is to persist. Our job is not to give up. Our job is not to be distracted by criticisms that come from all quarters all the time because now somebody doesn't like this or somebody doesn't like that. It is our job to continue to try to bring about this peace and reconciliation. Most of our work is behind the scenes, so we are not the front line. We are not seen on television bringing the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan together. Other people are doing that, and they're doing a great work. We work at a different level. We work mostly at the level of experts, at the level of diplomats, at the level of mid-rank officials. We prepare the dish before it can be finally cooked completely. So that is our job. And it is something that, as I said, needs to be done with a lot of patience and a lot of dedication. Somebody asked me the other day, will you get the Nobel Prize? I said, we will never get the Nobel Prize. Why? Because this is a process. It's a relay race. In a relay race, you have a number of runners. Somebody runs with a piece of wood first to give it to the second one, and then the second one gives it to the third one, and the third one gives it to the fourth one, and then that fourth one will go across the finishing line. And in this work, it's exactly like that. We're in the first runner. We're never going to be in the finishing line because but we still have to run as much as we can. And if we don't run fast enough, the one at the end is never going to finish. So this is our process. This is how we operate. And this is the way that we can contribute to a better future for Armenia and Azerbaijan and also for the entire South Caucasus region.